Hello, I am Elder Dana C. Edmond, and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director for the Office of Regional Conference Ministries located in Huntsville, Alabama, on the campus of Oakwood University. This is the 80th anniversary of the start of regional conferences, and it has been our desire through the Communications Department of the Office for Regional Conference Ministries and the Regional Conference Retirement Plan to put a series of 4 short videos to tell you the history of regional conferences. So over these next 4 videos, we'll tell you how we got regional conferences, why we got regional conferences, and why we still need regional conferences. I also want to, at the beginning of this series, tell you about some excellent resources in terms of African American Adventist history. The first one is found right here in our building, the Charles E. Dudley Center for Regional Conference Ministries. Here we have the one of only 2 Adventist African American history museums. And you can, particularly if you live in the Huntsville area, we want you to come by, or if you're visiting Huntsville, we want you to come by and see for yourself of the things that we're talking about. I also want to share with you some excellent books written by 2 men that I consider 2 of the leading historians in our church, particularly as it relates to African American Adventist history. The first one is Calvin Rock, a former president of Oakwood, wrote an excellent book called Protest and Progress. And it is one of the major resources for our videos. Another gentleman by the name of Dr. Douglas Morgan, he wrote a book called Change Agent, and it talks about particularly the start of regional conferences. He also wrote another book called Miracle of Courage, Color, and Christ, a 125-year history of the First Church of Seventh-day Adventists of Washington, D.C., which is, depending on who you listen to, one is either the oldest or one of the oldest African-American churches that exist. And it also talks a lot about, gives a lot of background and context for the beginning of regional conferences. And now, our story. Our story, at least as it relates to this first video, centers around 3 pivotal figures. The first one is Charles M. Kinney. Charles M. Kinney was the first African American Seventh-day Adventist pastor to be ordained. He was ordained in the last part of the 19th century in Nashville. Keep in mind, not only were there not very many Adventist pastors who were Black, there were not very many Adventists, period. So he gets ordained, brings his family in this setting in Nashville, Tennessee, where he wants his family to be seated for his ordination. And unfortunately, that didn't, him wanting to sit with, have mixed seating, that is to say, Black and white people sitting in the same setting in Nashville, Tennessee, it did not sit too well. And so the drama that came as a result of that made Charles M. Kinney say, we're not going to leave the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but maybe what we need are our own entities. And he said this about 50 years before regional conferences got started. The next pivotal figure that I want to talk to you about is a man by the name of Claude Barnett. Claude Barnett has the unique distinction of being a pivotal figure in African American Adventist history without actually being an Adventist. He was a journalist And he operated what was in essence the black version of what used to be. Um, if you remember back in the day, you would have entities like United Press International, and they would share stories among affiliated newspapers. Well, in those days, we had black newspapers, and so Claude Barnett in essence ran the black version of United Press International, and he had some Adventist friends. One in particular was Owen Troy Sr., who was a black Seventh-day Adventist pastor. His son, Owen Troy Jr., also became an pastor, and now is one of our oldest retirees. Um, we're not exactly sure how much Owen Troy shared with Claude Barnett, but we do know Claude Barnett was very informed about how difficult it was to be a black Seventh-day Adventist in a church that regrettably was every bit as segregated as the rest of American society was in those days. And Claude Barnett wrote about some of those difficulties. Um, Things like segregated seating at what was then Emmanuel Missionary College. Now it's Andrews University. And in those days, um, um, if you ate in the cafeteria, you had to sit at the color table, which actually was better than the General Conference, who in those days did not allow African Americans to eat in the cafeteria at all. And so Claude Barnett wrote about those sad things, and it kind of embarrassed the church. But then came the straw that broke the camel's back. Lucy Byard. Lucy Byard lived in New York. She had a form of cancer that ultimately took her life. She wanted to be treated in an Adventist hospital. The closest Adventist hospital was Washington Sanitarium, which, like most entities, Adventist entities in those days, did not allow um, African Americans to be a part of their institutions. In other words, this African American Adventist woman could not be treated in an Adventist hospital. But here's what happened. Lucy Byard was very fair-skinned. And so there are two different versions of what happened. She gets to the hospital and she's admitted. One version says she was admitted because she was fair-skinned. That's what that's that's the version that you hear most often. The other version is there were at least a few administrators who knew that she was African American, admitted her, and then just kind of lost their nerve. Either way, Lucy Byard was admitted and then kicked out of Washington Sanitarium, Adventist Hospital. She was kicked out of that hospital for the sole reason that she was black. This caused an uproar. And it so happened that in Washington, D.C., there was an unusually large amount of, of educated people in those days who were black in those. In other words, this 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 particular area had a larger than normal amount of highly educated black people for that time. One of the people who went who was a member of the church there in Washington was Eva B. Dykes, who's who, if you're connected with Oakwood, you know that Eva B. Dykes was the first person, first African American female to finish the requirements for a PhD. The library, which is not too far from our studio, is named after Eva B. Dykes. And there were other uh, um, entrepreneurs and educated people who formed a committee called the Committee for the Worldwide Work Amongst Colored Seventh-day Adventists. They petitioned the General Conference, in essence, said, enough discrimination. The sad thing about the Adventist Church in those days was they did not have very many facilities at all for African Americans. And when I say facilities, I mean hospitals, schools. There are very few schools. In fact, there was just Oakwood in those days. And even Oakwood was segregated in that the white staff sat on one side of the church and the black students sat on the other side. Um, but Oakwood was one of the few institutions that admitted black people. So black Seventh-day Adventists faced a conundrum of there weren't very many entities for black people, and we couldn't get into the Caucasian entities. So this committee petitioned the General Conference, and as the Lord would have it, on as a result of the tragic incident that happened to Lucy Byard, who got put out of the hospital, got put out of Washington Sanitarium, sent to Washington Freedmen's Hospital, which today is Howard University Hospital, which today is an Adventist hospital. But as a result of all of that, the General Conference met in the spring meeting. Most people think of the General Conference only meeting every 5 years, but actually the General Conference Executive Committee meets twice a year, in the spring and in the fall. That particular year, they met in Chicago at the Stevens Hotel, which today is the Chicago Hilton, and they voted to authorize unions to form what they called colored conferences. And here, as we close, are two important things I want to tell you about those conferences, that vote rather. One, the action specified those conferences should be administered by colored pastors and colored laymen. The reason why that was significant was up to that time, black people couldn't run hardly anything. In those days, because there were no regional conferences, the work among African Americans was run out of the General Conference, out of what was called the Negro Department. The first 3 directors of the Negro Department were not Negroes. They were Caucasians, because black people were not thought to be capable of running anything. So it was very significant that this action specified to be administered by colored pastors and colored lay people. The second thing that's significant about this vote is that it was a vote by the General Conference. In other words, regional conferences did not start because black people got mad and said, we out. The regional conferences got started by a vote of the General Conference. Now, I need to point out in closing that was not the only option. The General Conference could have voted to fully integrate, but faced with a choice between full integration and regional conferences, our church chose regional conferences. And what I want to close by pointing out is, even though regional conferences were formed under tragic circumstances, the Lord has blessed the regional conferences over the last 80 years. They've grown at a rate that's significantly higher than the rest of the church in North America, which demonstrate once again that God is always in control, and he's always able to take something bad and make something good to come out of it.